Imagine a world where the most sacred bonds of love and family are corrupted by the unrelenting hunger for power and control, where innocence is transformed into a tool of oppression, and where the darkness within the human soul is allowed to take form in reality. Picture a house where the laughter of children is silenced by coercion, where bodies are not vessels of life but instruments of domination, and where the very act of creation, the birth of life, is forced into the machinery of cruelty. In this world, the boundaries between love and exploitation, family and slavery, moral conscience and shadowed desire blur until what should nurture life instead perpetuates suffering. This is not merely history. It is a mirror of the shadow that resides within every human soul, waiting to be acknowledged or acted upon. The shadow of humanity's soul manifests in the most grotesque and intimate of ways when the deepest moral taboos are transgressed under the guise of power, tradition, or necessity. And nowhere is this more starkly illustrated than in the deliberate commodification of human life within the plantation system of 1860s Louisiana. To understand the act of turning one's own daughters into instruments of exploitation, one must first look beyond the surface of historical facts and into the psychic undercurrents that allow such atrocities to take root. The shadow, in its Jungian conception, is the repository of everything that society and the conscious self reject, deny, or repress, yet it is also an inescapable part of the human psyche. The plantation, with its rigid hierarchies and obsession with wealth, becomes a physical embodiment of the unconscious mind in which darkness is not only tolerated but institutionalized, where the moral compass of family and community is inverted to justify acts that are otherwise unthinkable. This inversion does not occur in a vacuum. It is a reflection of the inner landscape of those who wield control. The act of enslaving one's own children, turning them into vessels for perpetuating a system of domination, is a symbolic and literal merging of shadow and action, a demonstration of the ways in which unacknowledged impulses, greed, lust, dominance, and fear, are projected outward and enacted upon others. Here, the shadow is not abstract, it becomes flesh, measured in the suffering of the young and innocent, in the distortion of familial love into mechanisms of oppression. It is within this intimate violation that the deepest psychological truths about human nature are revealed. The capacity for cruelty is not merely circumstantial, but embedded within the psyche when unchecked by reflection, empathy, or conscience. In the context of Louisiana plantations, the shadow is amplified by cultural and structural reinforcements. The legal and economic systems provide a framework within which the darkest desires of the psyche can be expressed with impunity. Slavery becomes the stage on which the shadow performs, and the plantation owner, in turning his daughters into breeders, is simultaneously actor, audience, and victim of the same psychological pattern. The daughters themselves embody the paradoxical nature of the shadow. They are both extensions of the self and externalized objects, symbols of innocence corrupted and power exploited. The act is grotesque, not only because of its immediate cruelty, but because it reveals the psychic mechanisms that allow a human being to justify domination over even the most sacred bonds. The shadow, by definition, thrives in secrecy, in the unconscious rationalizations that hide horror behind appearances of civility, refinement, and necessity. Within the walls of the plantation house, one can almost sense the duality: the polite manners, the ostentatious displays of culture, and the veneer of gentility masking an abyss of moral decay. This duality reflects the universal human struggle. To repress, deny, or control the shadow is to invite its eruption in destructive ways, often against the most vulnerable and intimate aspects of life, including family. In this sense, the Louisiana plantation is a psychological laboratory where the consequences of unexamined shadows are magnified and given form. The commodification of human life, especially one's own kin, illustrates how the shadow does not merely reside in individual acts of cruelty, but becomes systemic, entwining with the structures of society to create a moral inversion so profound that it redefines love, loyalty, and duty into tools of exploitation. The shadow also illuminates the relational dimension of morality. The corruption of one's own family points to a failure not just in ethical judgment, but in the capacity to relate authentically to others, to recognize their inherent humanity. It is here, in the obliteration of relational empathy, that the shadow becomes most visible. It is not enough to see slavery as a socio-economic phenomenon. The true horror lies in how deeply it penetrates the human psyche, in how individuals can consciously commit acts that violate the most fundamental instincts of care, trust, and protection, particularly toward those who should be most sacred, one's children. This transgression reveals that the shadow is not merely a metaphorical concept, but a living, breathing force capable of shaping lives, molding actions, and determining the trajectory of generations. Moreover, the shadow's presence reminds us that history is not only a record of external events, but also a mirror reflecting the internal potentials of human consciousness, potentials for both creation and destruction. In Louisiana in 1860, the act of enslaving one's daughters as breeders crystallizes this dark potential, offering a window into the ways in which the human soul, when disconnected from moral and spiritual grounding, can transform the most intimate relationships into instruments of terror. The plantation owner becomes an archetype of the shadow fully realized, a being who sacrifices empathy for control, love for dominion, and humanity for power, illustrating a universal truth that the darkest deeds of history are never isolated, but are always intertwined with the depths of the psyche that created them. It is within these depths, within the shadow of humanity itself, that we encounter the haunting truth, that evil is not simply external, and that the most profound moral catastrophes emerge when the unexamined aspects of the self are projected outward, unchecked and unchallenged, shaping reality in their own distorted image. The plantation system in Louisiana during the 1860s was not only an institution built on cruelty and economic exploitation, but it also became a crucible in which the psychic wounds of generations were forged, a place where the sins of the past accumulated like sediment in the unconscious of a people. The act of turning daughters into breeders represents more than a single family's moral collapse. It embodies a pattern of ancestral trauma, a curse that resonates through time and affects not only those directly enslaved, but also those who claim ownership over them. The notion of an ancestral curse, in psychological terms, speaks to the unacknowledged transgressions and shadowed impulses that ripple through lineages, shaping behaviors, desires, and moral perceptions across generations. In Louisiana, the commodification of life and the perversion of familial bonds created a psychic residue, an invisible inheritance of guilt and corruption that would not simply vanish with the passage of time. The descendants of both the oppressors and the oppressed carry the weight of these actions in ways that manifest psychologically, socially, and even physiologically as patterns of fear, repression, and internalized oppression. The collective guilt embedded within this historical moment reveals itself as a silent, insidious force, one that haunts the conscience even when the individual actors are long gone. It is the haunting of unacknowledged crimes, a spectral memory embedded in the consciousness of a community, echoing the Jungian idea that the unexamined shadow of the collective mind will inevitably seek expression, often through repetition, projection, or ritualized patterns of behavior. The Louisiana plantation becomes more than a historical setting. It is a symbolic stage on which the intergenerational transmission of trauma, shame, and unprocessed evil plays out. The daughters, as instruments of enforced breeding, are the living embodiment of this curse, their bodies and lives appropriated to perpetuate not only the economic goals of slavery, but also the psychic distortions of their lineage. Their experiences are simultaneously personal tragedies and archetypal symbols, representing the way in which ancestral sins can distort the natural flow of human life, twisting innocence into tools of domination and subjugation. This is the essence of collective guilt. It is a burden that is never fully individualized because it exists in the relational and social dimensions of human existence, lodged in the interconnections between oppressors and victims, parents and children, masters and enslaved. By participating in this system, individuals both perpetuate and are entrapped by the curse, unable to disentangle themselves from the psychic consequences of prior actions. The ancestral curse also manifests in the cultural consciousness, shaping myths, stories, and social expectations in ways that normalize or obscure the horror. The obsession with bloodlines, purity, and control is a symbolic reflection of the unresolved tension between the human desire for power and the moral recognition of life's sanctity. Louisiana's plantations, with their meticulously structured hierarchies and rigid enforcement of racialized power, become both literal and metaphorical sites of this curse, where guilt is denied but simultaneously inscribed into the very fabric of social reality. The children produced under these conditions, both white and black, inherit not only the biological consequences of their parents' actions, but also the psychological echoes, a sense of displacement, internalized shame, and relational distortion that reverberates through their personal and social lives. This cycle demonstrates the profound truth that evil is rarely contained within a single act or individual. It propagates through networks of relationships and through time, becoming an almost autonomous force that shapes consciousness and behavior beyond the immediate context. In this sense, the plantation operates as both prison and crucible. It confines the body while simultaneously forging the invisible chains of collective guilt and ancestral curse. The curse is not merely punitive, it is formative, structuring the moral and psychological landscape of those who dwell within its sphere. To confront such a curse requires more than legal or historical reckoning. It requires the confrontation of the collective shadow, the willingness to acknowledge the weight of unprocessed sin, and the commitment to interrupt patterns of repetition that would otherwise continue unchecked. The Louisiana context shows that when societies fail to confront the ethical implications of their actions, the consequences become embedded in the psyche of generations, manifesting in both overt and subtle ways. A society haunted by inequity, individuals struggling with the legacy of trauma, and a culture continuously negotiating the tension between denial and memory. The act of enslaving one's own daughters crystallizes this curse with unbearable clarity. It is a violent affirmation of power over life and love, a symbolic act that inscribes guilt into the very blood of the family and the community. The ancestral curse, therefore, is both a moral and psychological reality, a reminder that human actions leave marks beyond the immediate sphere, that the sins of the past shape the unconscious of the present, and that collective guilt, when unacknowledged, continues to haunt, distort, and demand reconciliation, carrying with it both the lessons and the burdens of history. The desecration of the feminine principle in the context of the Louisiana plantation system of 1860 is not simply a historical detail, but a profound psychological and symbolic act that reveals the depth of human corruption when power and domination are placed above the sacred rhythms of life. The feminine principle, in its archetypal sense, represents creation, nurturance, intuition, and the life-giving forces that connect humanity to the cycles of nature and spirit. When daughters were turned into slave breeders, their bodies were no longer regarded as expressions of individuality, choice, or sacredness. Instead, they were instruments to fulfill economic and social ambitions, stripped of their intrinsic humanity. This perversion of the feminine is both literal and archetypal, illustrating how the subjugation of women and the violation of maternal and reproductive agency mirrors a broader spiritual imbalance in the psyche of a society. The act of forcing women into breeding roles under coercion is a symbolic annihilation of the nurturing aspect of existence, a suppression of the natural generative power that sustains life and nourishes the soul. By transforming daughters into commodities for the perpetuation of slavery, the patriarchal system not only enslaved bodies, but also sought to suppress and control the sacred creative energy that the feminine embodies. The desecration here operates on multiple levels. It is physical, psychological, and symbolic, leaving deep scars that extend beyond the immediate victims to infect the consciousness of those who wield power, as well as those who witness the violation. The daughters, trapped in roles imposed upon them by familial and societal authority, become living symbols of the distortion of the feminine, forced to participate in a system that transforms their capacity for creation into a tool of exploitation. Their experiences exemplify the tragedy of a society in which the masculine archetype has been twisted into domination rather than integration, where control and aggression replace protection and harmony. The plantation itself can be seen as a symbolic structure mirroring the imbalance between masculine and feminine energies. Rigid, ordered, and hierarchical, it suppresses life's natural spontaneity and nurturance, demanding obedience and submission from those it encompasses. Within this structure, the feminine is not honored but violated, and the violation is ritualized and normalized as part of the economic and social system. This demonstrates a profound psychic truth. When the feminine principle is desecrated, society destabilizes itself, severing the essential connection between creation and care, between life and consciousness. The consequences of this desecration ripple outward, affecting the psyche of the oppressors as well as the oppressed. Those who commit such acts of domination, even against their own children, are not merely exercising power. They are enacting a profound internal fragmentation, a split between conscience and desire, between moral understanding and the compulsions of greed and control. The shadow of the psyche finds a tangible outlet in these acts, revealing the destructive consequences when the creative and nurturing dimensions of humanity are subordinated to instrumental and material objectives. Symbolically, the daughter's forced roles also reflect the broader societal denial of the feminine principle, manifesting in the suppression of empathy, emotional intelligence, and relational ethics. By commodifying life and treating the generative capacities of women as objects for manipulation, the plantation system institutionalized a collective spiritual blindness, demonstrating that the desecration of the feminine is not only an assault on individual women, but also a destabilizing force for the moral and psychic equilibrium of an entire society. The repeated enactment of such desecration reinforces cultural patterns of domination and devaluation, perpetuating the belief that power and control justify the violation of natural and sacred processes. In this context, the trauma of the feminine becomes both personal and collective. It resides in the lived experiences of the women whose bodies and agency are exploited, and it becomes a symbol of the rupture in the social and spiritual order that allows oppression to flourish unchecked. Furthermore, the desecration of the feminine principle serves as a mirror, reflecting the internal corruption of those who perpetrate these acts. The failure to recognize and honor the creative and nurturing aspects of life is indicative of a profound moral and psychic imbalance. A projection of shadow impulses, that are acted out externally rather than integrated and understood internally. Louisiana's plantations, in their obsession with control, wealth, and bloodlines, became arenas in which this imbalance was not only expressed but magnified, showing that the violation of the feminine archetype destabilizes both the individual soul and the collective psyche. The daughters, reduced to instruments of reproductive labor, embody the psychic consequences of this imbalance, revealing how deeply oppression and moral corruption can penetrate into the very fabric of family, community, and societal structure. The desecration is a wound that carries the potential for both repetition and psychic inheritance, creating patterns that echo across generations, challenging humanity to confront its own capacity for cruelty and its failure to honor the sacred dimensions of life. The split between the conscious and unconscious self is vividly illustrated in the context of the Louisiana plantation system, where the brutal realities of slavery and the intimate corruption within families reveal the profound psychic divisions inherent in human nature. In this period, the conscious self, the socially acceptable, rational, and morally cognizant aspect of identity, coexisted with an unconscious self that harbored repressed desires, unacknowledged greed, and compulsions for domination. The plantation owner who turned his own daughters into instruments of oppression exemplifies the extreme consequences of this psychic division. For in consciously maintaining the veneer of civility, refinement, and paternal authority, he simultaneously enacted unspeakable cruelty rooted in the unconscious. The conscious self projected an image of order, propriety, and familial duty. Yet beneath this surface lay an unexamined, shadowed aspect of the psyche that sought control, power, and exploitation without moral restraint. This duality is not simply an individual phenomenon, but reflects a universal human condition, the tension between who we perceive ourselves to be and the repressed, often destructive energies that reside in the unconscious. On the plantation, this split becomes a living drama, enacted in the daily realities of life and death, intimacy and violation. The daughters themselves occupy a tragic space within this psychic dichotomy. As living extensions of both the conscious and unconscious ambitions of their father, they are simultaneously revered as family and dehumanized as instruments of labor and reproduction. Their bodies and identities become battlegrounds where the conscious desire for societal respectability and moral self-image collides with the unconscious pursuit of domination and material gain. In Jungian terms, this dynamic illustrates the projection of shadow elements onto others, where the darkest impulses of the self are externalized and enacted in the world rather than confronted internally. The plantation, with its rigid hierarchies and codified oppression, becomes a tangible manifestation of the unconscious mind, a structure in which moral contradictions are both embedded and normalized. The conscious self, seeking to maintain social and familial appearances, rationalizes acts of immense cruelty, while the unconscious self revels in the unbridled exercise of power over life, freedom, and kinship. This split generates a psychological tension that is both profound and destructive, for it allows individuals to function within moral and social frameworks while simultaneously committing acts that violate the most fundamental ethical and human principles. The psychological consequences of such a split are significant, producing internal fragmentation, emotional repression, and moral dissonance. The plantation owner embodies an archetype of divided consciousness. He is the protector and the oppressor, the nurturer and the exploiter, the figure of authority and the instrument of chaos. This duality mirrors a broader societal tension in which the economic and social structures of slavery enabled the coexistence of moral rationalization and psychic repression, allowing individuals and communities to maintain a semblance of civility while perpetuating profound injustice. The split between conscious and unconscious self also illuminates the mechanisms of denial, rationalization, and projection that facilitate systemic oppression. By refusing to acknowledge the moral implications of enslaving one's own children, the conscious self isolates itself from the destructive impulses of the unconscious. Yet in doing so, it permits these impulses to act with unchecked force in the external world. This dynamic highlights the danger of unexamined psychic content. When shadow elements are denied or repressed, they seek expression in ways that can be destructive, exploitative, and dehumanizing, often targeting those closest and most vulnerable. The Louisiana Plantation, in its obsessive structuring of hierarchy, race, and family, provides the perfect environment for the split to be enacted on a monumental scale. The internal divisions of the psyche are mirrored in the social divisions of the world. The owner versus the enslaved, parent versus child, moral self versus shadow self. Each act of cruelty, each enforced reproduction, each moment of denial reinforces the split, embedding it not only in individual consciousness, but also in collective culture. Moreover, the split between conscious and unconscious self is not limited to the oppressors. The enslaved and their descendants also bear the imprint of this psychic division, as they are forced to navigate the unpredictable and often contradictory expressions of power, love, and violence emanating from those who dominate them. In this way, the consequences of the split reverberate across relationships, communities, and generations, demonstrating that the psychic divisions of one individual or class can have far-reaching consequences, shaping the moral and emotional landscape of an entire society. The tragedy of Louisiana's plantations thus serves as a profound illustration of how the failure to integrate conscious awareness with unconscious impulses can lead to moral catastrophe, psychic fragmentation, and the erosion of ethical and relational life. It is a stark reminder that the unexamined self, when allowed to act unchecked, can produce horrors not only against others, but also against the very foundations of human dignity, love, and family, manifesting in a reality where the external world becomes the theater of unresolved inner conflict. The myth of purity, so meticulously constructed within the plantation society of 1860 Louisiana, operates not only as a social and racial ideology, but as a profound psychological delusion that masks moral decay while perpetuating it. This myth, anchored in obsessions with bloodlines, heritage, and social standing, becomes a lens through which the plantation owner justifies the most intimate and destructive violations, including the coercion of his own daughters into reproductive servitude. On a conscious level, the pursuit of purity is framed as an act of preservation, a maintenance of order, legitimacy, and civilization. Yet beneath this veneer lies a shadowed dimension where fear, greed, and the desire for dominance warp natural human relations. The archetype of purity, when externalized as an obsession with lineage and control over reproductive capacity, becomes a vessel for the projection of unconscious desires and anxieties, where the human body is transformed into an instrument to assert social and economic control. Within this distorted logic, the body is divorced from individuality, from the sacredness of life, and from the natural processes of creation, reduced instead to a vehicle for maintaining the illusion of social superiority. This distortion signals the emergence of psychological decay, as the very mechanisms that are supposed to ensure societal cohesion, love, family, morality, and trust, are perverted into tools of oppression. The daughters, compelled to produce life under coercion, are symbolic manifestations of the ways in which purity becomes a myth that dehumanizes and objectifies, reinforcing the collective shadow of the plantation culture. They embody the tragic inversion of life-giving forces, where creation, which should be an expression of vitality and connection, becomes an instrument of economic and ideological enforcement. The psychological decay born from this myth is not confined to individual pathology. It extends into the cultural and social framework, infecting the conscience of an entire community. Obsessions with blood purity, racial hierarchies, and social dominance are rationalized as moral imperatives, yet they serve primarily as masks for unexamined desires and compulsions that have been displaced from the conscious mind into the external world. The decayed psyche of the plantation owner is mirrored in the structure of the plantation itself, rigid, hierarchical, and meticulously controlled, enforcing a system where moral integrity is subordinated to the demands of social and economic control. The myth of purity also operates as a mechanism of projection, where internal corruption, moral uncertainty, and latent cruelty are externalized onto others, most visibly onto the enslaved and the daughters compelled to reproduce. This projection allows the conscious self to maintain a self-image of civility and righteousness, while acting in ways that are profoundly destructive and morally corrupt. The plantation culture, in its obsession with purity, reveals how societal myths, when entwined with unexamined shadow elements, can produce widespread moral and psychological pathology, where acts of intimate cruelty are normalized and rationalized as necessary for the maintenance of order and lineage. In this context, psychological decay manifests in multiple ways: in the erosion of empathy, in the distortion of familial bonds, in the prioritization of material and social power over human life, and in the internal conflicts generated by the tension between conscious ideals and unconscious impulses. The very pursuit of purity, intended to safeguard the lineage and reputation, becomes a catalyst for moral corruption, illustrating that obsession with external forms of order without internal ethical and spiritual grounding inevitably leads to destruction. The myth of purity, therefore, is simultaneously an ideology and a psychic mechanism, binding the conscious self to illusions while allowing the shadow to operate unchecked, producing acts of unimaginable cruelty, including the subjugation of one's own children. This dynamic reveals the broader implications for societies that institutionalize such myths. The external structures of law, economy, and hierarchy are not neutral, but are infused with the unintegrated shadow of those who design and sustain them, perpetuating cycles of exploitation, dehumanization, and psychological injury. The daughters, as both victims and symbols, carry the burden of this decay, illustrating how the consequences of myth, ideology, and projection extend beyond the immediate actors to shape the emotional, moral, and spiritual landscape of generations. The plantation, in its obsession with bloodlines and controlled reproduction, serves as a stark representation of how the pursuit of purity can become the very instrument of corruption, demonstrating that moral and psychological integrity cannot be divorced from the recognition and integration of the human shadow. In the end, the myth of purity is both a cultural and psychic pathology, one that produces profound distortions of relationship, morality, and self-understanding, revealing how human beings, in their attempts to control and dominate, can create conditions in which the sacred aspects of life are desecrated, the natural rhythms of creation are violated, and the decay of the psyche becomes a generational inheritance. The path toward redemption and integration emerges as both a psychological necessity and a moral imperative in the aftermath of profound human cruelty, as exemplified by the Louisiana plantation system of 1860, when generations of suffering have been perpetuated through acts of domination, exploitation, and the desecration of family. The human psyche is left fragmented, burdened by the weight of unacknowledged shadow elements and collective guilt. Redemption, in the Jungian sense, requires a confrontation with the totality of the self, including the aspects that have been repressed, denied, or projected outward onto others. The plantation, as a symbol of systemic evil, represents both the external manifestation of moral failure and the internal landscape of the fractured human psyche. To move toward integration, it is necessary to acknowledge the realities of such atrocities, not merely as historical facts, but as reflections of the shadow within the human soul. This acknowledgement involves facing the psychic residues of oppression, the lingering effects of trauma, and the unconscious impulses that allowed cruelty to flourish in the first place. Integration, in this context, is not simply a psychological process. It is a moral act that involves reclaiming the humanity that was violated, both in oneself and in the relationships that have been distorted by historical injustice. The daughters forced into reproductive slavery, the enslaved families whose lives were commodified, and the broader society all carry fragments of a disrupted moral and psychic order. Redemption, therefore, requires a conscious engagement with the full spectrum of human experience, including the darkest impulses that history often attempts to hide. The process begins with recognition, acknowledging the existence of cruelty, the complicity of those who perpetrated it, and the systemic conditions that allowed it to continue. This recognition is painful, for it requires an honest appraisal of human nature, revealing the capacity for greed, lust for power, and dehumanization that resides within everyone. Yet, it is precisely this confrontation that allows the shadow to be integrated rather than acted out destructively. Integration involves the transformation of unconscious impulses into conscious understanding, where moral and ethical discernment becomes informed by an awareness of the destructive potentials within the self. For society and for individuals, this means confronting the ways in which historical atrocities continue to influence thought, behavior, and cultural norms. The psychic weight of unprocessed trauma and collective guilt cannot simply be erased. It must be met, understood, and transformed. In practical terms, this transformation may manifest as empathy, social responsibility, and ethical action, but on a deeper, symbolic level, it represents the reconciliation of the divided self. The conscious and unconscious, the oppressor and the victim, the light and shadow aspects of the psyche must be brought into dialogue so that repetition of past atrocities is no longer inevitable. The path toward redemption is also relational. It involves repair not only within the self, but between individuals, communities, and generations. The descendants of both the oppressed and the oppressors carry psychic and moral legacies that demand acknowledgement and integration. This may take the form of restorative justice, historical education, and cultural reckoning, but it also entails the internal work of cultivating awareness, compassion, and a commitment to ethical living. Only through such processes can the cycles of denial, projection, and exploitation be interrupted, allowing the fragments of moral and psychological integrity to coalesce. The daughters and enslaved individuals, as symbols of violated innocence and distorted life forces, serve as reminders of what is at stake in the work of integration. Their suffering is both historical and archetypal, pointing to universal patterns of human destructiveness and the necessity of conscious engagement with them. By confronting these patterns, the human psyche can begin to reclaim agency over impulses that once expressed themselves through domination, cruelty, and dehumanization. Redemption is not a single act, but an ongoing process, a commitment to bringing light into darkness, awareness into repression, and ethical clarity into moral ambiguity. It involves the courage to face uncomfortable truths, to hold the tension between recognition of evil and the desire for moral restoration, and to navigate the difficult terrain of inherited guilt and trauma. In the symbolic realm, the Louisiana Plantation becomes a stage for this transformative work. The horrors of history are not erased but understood as reflections of internal processes that, once acknowledged, can lead to growth and integration. The psychic and moral work of integration transforms the legacy of destruction into a source of insight, empathy, and renewed ethical commitment. It is through this process that the fragmented self, the divided society, and the wounded collective consciousness can begin to heal. Redemption, therefore, is both a psychological and spiritual imperative, requiring engagement with the shadow, acknowledgement of collective guilt, and the conscious cultivation of moral and relational integrity. It is a path that demands courage, insight, and commitment, offering the possibility of transforming the psychic and moral decay wrought by oppression into a foundation for conscious, compassionate, and ethical existence, where the lessons of history inform and guide the development of a more integrated and humane society. The story of the Louisiana plantations, of daughters turned into instruments of exploitation, and of generations shaped by cruelty and unacknowledged shadow, is a reflection of the human psyche at its most fractured and dangerous. Yet within this darkness lies the potential for awakening, for redemption, and for integration. By confronting the truths of the past, by acknowledging the collective guilt and moral fractures that allowed such acts to occur, humanity can begin to reclaim the sacred dimensions of life, love, and creation that were violated. The path toward healing is neither easy nor immediate. It demands courage, honesty, and the willingness to face the shadow within ourselves and in our societies. Only by doing so can we transform cycles of oppression into opportunities for awareness, compassion, and ethical responsibility, ensuring that the lessons of history illuminate the path to a more conscious, integrated, and humane future.